Hey everyone, it's Short Fiction Friday. This week I read through 3 short stories. The Fly by George Langelaan, Crab Apple Crisis by George MacBeth, and Then the Dark by James Sallis. Let's start with George Langelaan's The Fly. This story was first published in the June 1957 issue of Playboy. This short story was excellent, and if you've seen the 1958 movie The Fly, starring Vincent Price, the short story is very, very similar to that, right? So the movie was very faithful to the short story. Now I'm going to butcher all the French names in this story probably. Right at the start of this story, one of our main characters, André D'Alembert, he's had his head crushed in like an industrial press. So the beginning of this story is basically like a murder mystery. The police know that his wife, Helene, has done this, but the mystery is, why did she do this? At all appearances, they seem like a happily married couple. This would be a very slow death, so presumably Andre must have had a hand in this as well. So the mystery is, why did this happen? As the story progresses, you find out that Andre is a scientist and he's working on transporter technology, so moving a person from one place to another instantaneously. So something must have gone wrong with these experiments, leading ultimately to his death. If you're a person who's maybe only seen the Cronenberg version of The Fly, I would really highly recommend this, and I would recommend the 1958 movie. They're quite a bit different from the Cronenberg movie, and still very, very good. There's a few small elements right towards the end that are different from the movies, so there was a little bit of an extra punch. Now, I have just one small criticism, and it's just a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. In one part of this story, you're reading Helene's confession, right? So it's framed as, this is her letter to the police. She's recounting what led up to this crime. And when you're reading her letter, you get her recounting like long conversations. Whenever that happens in a story, I think nobody would write a letter that way. Like, you just wouldn't write out long conversations between people as if you're quoting them verbatim. Anyway, that's a very small thing. This is a great story. Okay, the next thing I read was Crab Apple Crisis by George MacBeth. This first appeared in New Worlds in October of 1966. George MacBeth is mostly a poetry guy. If you look at his Goodreads, you'll see all sorts of poetry collections that he edited and put together. And Crab Apple Crisis is like a free verse poem. You know, like a poem that doesn't rhyme or anything like that. So I'll just show you the very start of it. It's written like this. I think that's free verse, right? I'm not really a poetry guy, so I don't know. So this is a very simple poem. It's about neighbors who start feuding over their gardens. And the poem works as a metaphor for escalation of war, and especially nuclear war. Now, I found it to be quite surface level. I didn't think there was really any insights here about development of war or the politics of war. It's very much just making the point, war can develop for kind of silly reasons, and here's how it might escalate. Yeah, I didn't think too much of this one, and as a humorous metaphor for war, I don't think that the jokes really stuck either. Now, there's another question about this. Does this count as science fiction? Because it's just a metaphor for nuclear war. To me, there's no real science fiction elements to this. Now, that doesn't really matter for my enjoyment when I'm reading it, but it does kind of affect your expectations when you're going into a book like this. All right, and the last thing that I read this week was And Then the Dark by James Sallis. Also in the War Book, edited by James Sallis, of course. This was the first publication of this particular story. And I was reading up on James Sallis a bit, and he was the editor of New Worlds magazine for a little bit. along with Michael Moorcock. In this story, we're following Mr. Davis. He's apparently a high-up, executive type in some sort of chemical weapons company, making napalm or something like that. And the idea is that he starts expressing doubts about the ethics of what he's doing. Seems like mostly writing a letter to his father, who I think is also an executive in this company. Because of this, it seems like he's getting a visit from a couple of government agent goons who put him under pressure and accuse him of sedition just for privately expressing some doubts about this. This story is very much told just as a slice of Mr. Davis's life, kind of goes through his family life and what he's thinking about as he gets a threatening visit from these two agents. This was a decent story. Once again, the science fiction elements are very, very minimal. Maybe you could say it's science fiction because it's set in a near future with a secessionist movement in the United States. It sort of reads like this could be any political thriller that's set in a kind of speculative future war or alternate history. So yeah, this was fine, but once again, I kind of question its inclusion in a science fiction book. But maybe that was kind of the point of New Worlds magazine, James Sallis, Michael Moorcock. I'm kind of under the impression that they liked to publish more literary things that maybe expanded the scope of what science fiction could be. So this was fine, but nothing special. All right, and ranking these stories, putting them into my top 15, my big list of short stories that I've read recently. I think The Fly is excellent. Now, just because I've seen the Vincent Price movie so many times, I was kind of reading through it and thinking, oh, this is just the Vincent Price movie, like beat for beat. So that just affected my own personal enjoyment of the short story because I knew exactly what was going to happen. But then towards the end, it gets really good and actually quite different from the Vincent Price movie. The story's great. I'm going to put it at number 4 on my list. The James Sallis and George MacBeth stories were pretty average, and they definitely won't be making this top 15 list. All right, let's select some short stories for next week. The way this works is very simple. I've got book 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. The 6-sided die selects the book. The 12-sided die selects the story within the book. Okay, first roll. Three and 3. That's the werewolf book. So I skip over the ones with pencil marks next to them. I've already read those stories. 1, 2, 3. Guilty Party by Stephen Laws. That story is 15 pages long. I'm going to keep on rolling the dice until I get to at least 50 pages. Second roll. 2 and 2. One, 2. We're reading Who Goes There by John W. Campbell. That's 64 pages long, which takes us well over the 50-page minimum. All right, I'll put the stories up on the screen here. I'm especially looking forward to Who Goes There. Yeah, the thing is great, and I've heard this short story is really good too. Go read these short stories if you have access to them, and I'll see you all next week. Thanks for watching. Bye.